Uganda is the largest producer of coffee in all of Africa because of Robusta. It's a Robusta country.
Because of Robusta, right?
And that's a volume-oriented crop. Another aside, just for fun, since we're geeking out on coffee, at least one way. If I were to ask you, where's the birthplace of coffee?
Ethiopia.
Why? Robusta has grown at lower altitudes. It's a more robust plant. It's bushier, smaller beans. From a flavor point of view, if you can imagine that top of the mouth tang, that sort of coating that you get from like an Italian style espresso, they oftentimes use a Robusta, 5, 10, up to 20%, and an Italian style espresso blend. So it's that sort of sharper kick. It's not considered to be the smooth flavors of Arabica. And in many ways, going back to the political economy of coffee, the US used a lot of Robusta. I work with Crop to Cup. We are coffee importers, but we're trying to do a slightly different orientation of that. So we functionally act as importers. We bring in coffee, buy these container loads, and we break it up into different smaller bags and sell it to different roasters.
Back, we're gonna start with your origin story. Where are you from originally?
Well, where am I from? I'm a Midwest corn-fed guy here from the suburbs of Chicago.
Oh, you're from Chicago?
Yeah. Have you seen Wayne's World?
I have, yes.
That's right, Aurora. So that's where.
Really?
Yeah, I grew up. It's a good place to grow up and a good place to get out of as well. Yeah. So from there, went to school in St. Louis. Didn't get that far away, but got a study abroad situation going for Switzerland. I was able to learn French, wanted to work for the United Nations, lived over there for an extra year afterwards, which was nice.
How far in did you make it to the UN job?
Delivering coffee, trying to get internships. I got to sit in on a commission for human rights, and I was so excited. I was a note taker. And I sat down, and it was a plenary session, and it ended up being about 3.5 days. And the only thing that was accomplished was how to calibrate headlights. Regulation for how headlights should be calibrated across the world. Much later, I've realized that that's actually pretty important, road safety stuff. But at the time, I was like, this is all happening in French. It needs to be translated to the local languages. Then needs to get put in law, and then somehow needs to make its way down to a trucker. And so it just seemed very distant, pretty far away from the work that needed to get done.
How do you go from there to your origins of coffee, more specifically Uganda, right? Which I believe is the place where you started.
Yeah. So my father's into public health. And so I thought at some time I wanted to get into public health. I was living in Switzerland, delivering coffee, used some of those relationships to translate into, I guess you could call it a research internship in northern Uganda. At a time, there was a nonprofit there called ACTU that was developing boreholes. And it was an interesting model. It was this public-private partnership. There's a private company that would go in there and dig the boreholes, but there was a nonprofit company that would go in there first and talk with the community and be like, hey, listen, what do you think about, I don't know, having a borehole with some water here? Do we have your support? Okay, let's do some education on clean water, public health, and then put together some grants. And they would write grants, and then those grants would pay for the private company to go in and dig boreholes. And it seemed a little bit slimy, right? And so the idea was to go and take a look at what how these things work. It turns out it just digs a lot of boreholes. It certainly is slimy, but it was an interesting sort of lubricated wheel within the cogs that was the international system. I went down there and I realized I didn't have any interest in that type of work. And I didn't really have the skills to be an engineer or the aptitudes to be a doctor. And those were the types of skills that were needed down there.
I think that's all they care about. When you show up, they're excited to see you.
Yeah. I was very much in the learning phase. I wasn't able to contribute much, but I did come back thinking about what they call in the international community's capacity development. So it's like there's a lot of good people doing good work. Like, how do you help them to do that work better, right? And so from there, I came back to finish my undergraduate studies in St. Louis. And some people I'd met when I was in Switzerland, a guy who's now my business partner, a good friend, Taylor, we came up with an idea called DevelopNet. It ended up being some rural internet cafes for NGO, CBO headquarters, basically at a time when there was no cell service in these areas.
What year was this?
This was 2003, 2004.
Okay.
Yeah.
So about 22, 23 years ago.
That's about right. Yeah. An image that sticks in my head is, when you're going through that part of the world at that time, there might be X's scratched out on the ground and a line of people just waiting to go stand at that X, because that's where you had cell phone signals. And so the idea of DevelopNet was just to see what we could do to, have some people that we met help them to do their work a little bit better. Coordination between local community groups, an office, internet cafe, these sort of things. But we wanted to do it in what we thought was the right way. So the idea was that half the money would have to come from within Uganda and half could come from international sources. There was going to be democratically owned, sort of asset, the building, the satellites run by this organization, this form of CBOs and NGOs. And it happened. It worked that way. It was a fun hustle. It was like interesting. I learned a lot by getting that done. And as it opened up, I just have to sort of preview that within a year later, some things went down. So the first of it is that the most organized groups that were members of this were agricultural groups. They were farmers groups. We're in a rural area, a place called Iganga in central Uganda. And the groups that were taking advantage of this new resource, they're all farmers. They're growing matoke, which is like a banana, or beans, or maize, or sometimes Robusta coffee, although that was not a focus. And every Wednesday or Sunday, they had to push their crops on bicycle, lay down a blanket in the community center, and sell to the same people who are growing the same crops, right? And then around 2 or 3 in the afternoon, trucks would come in, lorries that would just be coming from the nearest town, and they would just bid everybody down because no one's going to push their bike home with produce that goes bad. And so they would just bid everybody down, fill up the truck, and take it in. And it was just this idea of these price takers, right? These people that just didn't have connections to these, nearby cities. And these weren't really big cities, small cities, but regional cities. And the agriculture groups wanted to organize and see if they could get those lorries to come directly to them instead of coming to the town. The idea ended up being pretty successful, but it pissed off a lot of people within the town because all of a sudden, a tradition of market day that's gone on for who knows how long, right? Before time, right? Started having noticeably like a third less people, tax agencies, the taxi groups, the vendors, people that were in the village, not super happy. So anytime I would go into the countryside, it'd be fun. I'd be gifted cuckoos, chickens, and I have a lot of friends with farmers. But then I'd come back into the city, and it was this very different reception. So I was kind of fortunate at this time that the next phase of this nonprofit project was for the local group to take over complete operations, right? And so it was good for me and Taylor to back off a little bit. Partly through sort of the progress of this, partly through the relationships we had when we were in Switzerland, we were asked to do an audit of a coffee cooperative in Mbali.
That's how you end up in there.
Inter Coffee.
Right.
I don't know anything about auditing. I don't know anything about coffee. I just got this young 20s white boy confidence that I ended up learning a lot from. But it basically was like, yeah, okay, sure, we'll go figure it out. The situation was this: is that coffee in Uganda was nationalized under Idi Amin, and it was only privatized again in the 90s. And it's important because coffee it's political. And the political economy of coffee is very much my interest in coffee to date. But it's a way that people can mobilize 10,000 households across a mountain to go vote in a certain way. I mean, to date in Mexico, as you know, these ejidos and these other communities, their biggest revenue comes first from either remittances, but usually from education, from advocacy in public, in the public forum to get teachers and teacher salaries there. And coffee becomes like number 3, 4, or 5 priority when it comes down that pecking order.
Regardless of what state.
It's just political. Like these groups, when you're rural, it's political. And it's coffee is a way of mobilizing entire countrysides, right, to vote in one way. So you could call it a populist, or a peasant, economy in that sense, depending. So, in the 90s, which is, corollary in coffee. Meanwhile, in the 90s, we saw the coffee crisis of the 90s. So do you mind if I do a quick little aside here? Because
please do it.
A huge distraction, but I think it's incredibly important to understand, what I mean by political economy. So there was a speech in which Kennedy referred to coffee as the sword and shield against communism. And the idea was that a lot of these countries that were growing coffee were pink or maybe in danger of going red. Thinking of, your Venezuelas, your Nicaraguas, your Vietnams, right, your Sumatras. Yet Europe and the US was 80% of the consuming world. So they thought they could come up with something called the ICO, the International Coffee Organization, a minimum price quota that would set a minimum price and show the world that the free market works and increase and stabilize the minimum price for coffee farmers in all these areas. And they got sued. So this idea of the federal government interfering with markets, not so good, right? But in the interest of national security, the idea of a 5-cent cup of coffee got thrown out the window in exchange for these minimum price quotas, which is how things went. And price for coffee stayed mostly stable for many years. And then the Berlin Wall fell in '89, and the price quota fell the same year, just a few months after. And the price for coffee went to almost a third of where it was. And so people, to be clear, if you could get out of coffee, you did. You grew something else, or you moved to a city. You just didn't have a choice because people were starving. This became something that hit our consciousness as consumers as like the Sandinistas, if you remember things like this. But the response to this coffee crisis were movies like Black Gold, if you remember this, in the '90s, and the Fair Trade movement and the Certified Organic movement. And so this was, interestingly enough, the very first time that you could ever pay something more for coffee. So the birth of specialty coffee is in social justice, is as a response to the coffee crisis. Meanwhile, you have countries like Costa Rica that can't compete with the cost of production in Brazil. And so there's like, well, we have a tourism industry. We're pretty good at marketing. And so you can get some terrazoo, and you can start to get some of those, what we now recognize as sort of geographic specific coffees. And so that was happening around '90s at the same time. And as we sit here in Chicago, that was around the time that Jeff Watts was getting his start in coffee, in the late '90s, early noughts. And so we're really at the birth here of specialty coffee. Before this time, you couldn't pay a different price for different coffee, and there was no real mechanism or incentive for people differentiating. Coffee was coffee. It's a commodity, interchangeable.
Right.
So specialty has its start in these '90s and around this time. Unfortunately, in Uganda, coffee was privatized, and it was a race to the bottom. So people were putting stones in their bags of coffee. All quality practices are drying, thrown out the window. It was really just a kilograms game. Uganda is the largest producer of coffee in all of Africa because of Robusta. It's a Robusta country.
Because of Robusta, right.
And that's a volume-oriented crop. Another aside, just for fun, since we're geeking out on coffee, at least one way. If I were to ask you, where's the birthplace of coffee?
Ethiopia.
Why?
Simply, I think for me, it's because you take that plant, and that plant spreads to different continents, right? I believe it was Danish that brought it to the Americas.
That's right. Yeah.
That's how it ends up here. And therefore, when I think of the word origin, I only use it to talk about Ethiopia. Everything else for me is a place where coffee is grown.
Has gone too, yeah. That's right. And that plant being Arabica.
Correct.
Right. And you can go anywhere in Ethiopia and there'll be fights about, no, the first one was here. No, it was here. But where did Arabica come from?
Arab traders?
Robusta. If I were to ask you, where's the birthplace of Robusta? It's Uganda, right around the source of the Nile, near Jinja. And so in many ways, Uganda is overlooking its potential of claiming its birthright as the birthplace of coffee. And, when I got started in coffee many years ago, I was very interested in promoting specialty Robusta because of this. And I got known as a Robusta guy. I got laughed at.
Right.
Watch you, me.
You should probably explain the difference between Robusta.
Oh, sure. Two different genetics, So Robusta is grown at lower altitudes. It's a more robust plant. It's bushier, smaller beans. From a flavor point of view, if you can imagine that top of the mouth tang, that sort of coating that you get from like an Italian style espresso, they oftentimes use a Robusta, 5, 10, up to 20% in an Italian style espresso blend. Right. So it's that sort of sharper kick. It's not considered to be the smooth flavors of Arabica. And in many ways, going back to the political economy of coffee, U.S. used a lot of Robusta up until we were encouraged to put 100% Arabica on our labels to signify it as specialty.
There's also a big difference in the caffeine level.
There's a big difference in the caffeine level.
One will fuck you up if you do too much.
Yeah. But it can taste good.
Right.
And it just has never been processed. And so, people argue that, and I'm one of them, that if you've had a Robusta before and you didn't like it, well, you just had a mouthful of defects. But what if you were to grow that and Arabica doesn't taste the same now as it did even 20 years ago. It's been a sort of call and response conversation with the plant, with nature, and with what people want, as it is with agriculture. Robusta is the same. So there's truly cool things coming out now. And I think that the time is finally, maybe not here, but about to come, where people are going to be using a lot more Robusta.
I feel like I've been hearing that shit for 10 years now.
Yeah, maybe you've been talking to me for 10 years. That's why.
No, we had a conversation. What was our friend's name? The dude in Mexico who, remember, this is a great story. Now I'm getting sidetracked, but should we say who it is? The guy that showed up and
I like to keep names off the table.
Let's keep the names out. But this guy,
somebody you can tell the quality of a farm by tasting the dirt.
Yeah, correct.
I say that with all.
And the guy came up. He's like, "How you doing?" I said, shh, you got gold here. Mm-hmm. I was just like, "Oh shit, this guy knows his stuff." Yeah. But he was really into the Robusta game.
Yep.
In fact, I think some of it ended up here in one of these fancy coffee shops.
Yeah, it's still kind of viewed as like a specialty micro lot now, and it's got to be. I think people are starting to get back into blends. So I think that the authorship of coffee has changed.
So
Um,
how do you end up in getting involved in Uganda? Because I know the backstory to this, but
yeah, all right. So the backstory here is this: after the privatization in the '90s, there was a corruption, there was bad management, there was a race to the bottom in terms of quality, and what was formerly the monopoly of the area, the Bugisi Cooperative Union, and this is important. Just like cotton needs a mill, sugar needs a mill. You can't just export cotton. You can't export. You need, coffee needs a mill, and it's a heavy piece of machinery that presents it, like, takes it out of the sort of plant form, puts it into the burlap bags that are brought in, and what you need. And there was only one of them in this whole coffee producing area, right? And
really,
so if you can't really picture Uganda because it's not that type of podcast, not that type of show, but it's on the Kenyan border,
right,
and there's a mountain there called Mount Elgon, and
East Africa.
in East Africa, and you'd have to grow coffee there and then take it all the way back to Kampala, the capital, which is closer to the Congo than it is to the port, and then take it all the way back across Uganda and Kenya to the port.
After you process everything, you get it into the
Yep, that's right. So the importance of this mill was that you didn't have to do that, and it employed a lot of the town. So it's like the backbone of the economy of this place. I mean, coffee is really the only cash crop a lot of people have. It's only access to foreign currency that a lot of people have. So this is an important place, but it was belly up, insolvent, and it was going to go to be turned into a corn mill. And so a lot of the people that we had known in Switzerland were looking to provide a non-profit line of credit. I mean, the cost of capital, it's an interesting other side note, right? But it's really, really insanely expensive in East Africa. Even fully collateralized, you can't get money to work at 36, 40%, right? And so they were looking to
amazing.
bail them out, which is interesting. A quick little side note for me, debt is something that I think is really just a matter of optimism. It's a question of like, how much optimism? What do you think about the future? It's why the US has historically had some of the lowest rates of interest of anywhere in the world. We're optimistic. We think that you'll be worth more tomorrow. Everything will be fine, right? They don't have that same mentality in East Africa. So it's maybe corresponding that the rate of interest there is,
Right.
is high. But long story short is they didn't know who to trust. So they knew that they had Mzungus, these two white guys, hanging out in central Uganda to go out there and just sort of keep an eye on things. And so we did, but we didn't know what we were doing. So we just did things that made sense. And in short, it ended up with a traceability system that had coffee, as it was purchased, thousands of microtransactions happening every day. And coffee flows down mountain and gets brought into a warehouse. And it was just about sort of, helping to put systems in place for that. But it resulted in knowing where the coffees came from. And some coffees consistently tasted better than others. So as we'd ride up with the trucks or drive our trucks up and visit these farmers, we'd be like, why do you care? Why are you putting this extra effort in when you get paid the exact same as everybody else? And that was sort of the genesis. That was the start.
That's where the disruption began.
And that's where the disruption. Well, that's where the idea became, is that you could separate coffees.
What did that do to the local economy?
I mean, it happened to be right place, right time, right idea type situation. And so it's not me. It's not, just us. But, for example, before when we got started, a container of coffee is 20 tons, 40,000 pounds. Picture a tractor trailer, okay? And that was a lot of one. Okay, so one lot. And they're in these 60-kilo bags. It's 300 of those. It's 300 of these bags is one lot. And if anything came from this mountain, Mount Elgon, it had to be labeled as Elgon AA, Elgon PP, something like this, right? Even though there's a different tribe on there. The Sabe, they're in a place called Kapchora, Mississippi Falls. And they were at that time legally not even allowed to marry the Bugisu, just to some beef, some history that they had. It's just an example. But yet all of the coffee had to be exported as Bugisu, right? And so, but you couldn't take more than one lot on a coffee. So there were some regulations, some policies that needed to change. So to think about this idea of lot separation, of what's necessary, like these really small things take a lot of coordination.
Right.
Like the standardization of containers is amazing. It's magic that every bean that's picked all over the world can find a home, right? It's pretty magical the way that it works, right? It's clockwork. You change any part of that, it's so hard, right? So we talk about lot separation a lot in my business. And that's just this idea of having an intentionality, of not being a commodity, not being interchangeable, of engaging the farmer in the discussion of identifying quality, developing that quality, and getting the highest price possible for it, right? And so we call that the value chain. And that exists over the supply chain, which is the physical way that coffee moves. It determines the cost of getting coffee to port. But the value chain is anything that adds value, anything that changes that price or the demand for that coffee. Makes it taste better, improves the
Right.
connection. So engaging the farmer in that is really the story here. And the major tool for that, from our point of view, is lot separation. How do you make a blend? Even if you were to pick all the same coffee from one tree, over a course of a harvest, that's one way of making a blend.
This is very little experience. I mean, you at that time.
Yeah. Still, I mean,
you're making it up as you go along.
yeah,
But
yeah.
taking that information from somewhere, like you're not just pulling it out of your ass. You're like, okay, this is what I read up on it. This is therefore how the system should be, and this is how it, in some way.
Sure, but no, Angel, like the cool thing about this is that there used to be a debate, and I think you remember this, about whether coffee is an art or a science. Do you remember this debate? It's so gone and so dead that I don't think anybody remembers it because at that time we knew so little that there was more art than there was science, right? And now we know a lot more than we did then. There's an actual science.
I've been saying this. I think that every book that's been written about coffee from the last 15, 20 years is bullshit for the most part. I mean, you got the obvious stuff, but when it comes to making references to an Ethiopian is an Ethiopian because of this, and it tastes this way, Colombians taste this way, Mexican coffees taste this way, and you're like, that's not necessarily true. There's a lot of factors that play into it, but in the process of it, I think that it's not necessarily the importer, because they're just trying to sell the fucking coffee, and in a way they're trying to support the local community. It really comes from the people that are, whether it's a roaster or the coffee shop that's selling it, that is really taking that and adding that language around it. And for the most part, I've always felt like that was, there's a bit of racism that exists within it.
Oh yeah.
That's always what I thought. But my thing with this is that you're there at this point, you look like a fucking Ken doll in that place in Africa, and you're creating so much attention for yourself, changing a lot of the way that things have been done. And this is a country that historically, I mean, you mentioned Idi Amin, but you now have a president, Museveni, is that right?
Yeah, Museveni, yeah.
Museveni, right? Who going into his 5th term, something like that.
He's getting his son ready to take over. It's
right. Human rights violations, corruption. You have all this shit going on.
Yeah.
And you weren't scared that there was going to be some repercussions to the work that you were doing?
Well, first of all, I don't like taking a very visible role. My role in many ways is to build teams. There's a reason.
You stand out like a fucking sore thumb when you show up to places.
For sure. But I'm always invited in as a guest, if that makes sense. So, in very many ways, one of the big differences in a lot of my job, is, and you've heard me go through this many times, is to realign my expectations. I understand I look like a walking ATM. And, there's nothing, it actually makes it easier. But coffee gives us this beautiful passport to go places that I never would be able to go. The cost of it is that I'm an archetype, right? And so, people laugh at me because I'll, stand up for a speech in front of a group of, farmers in Uganda, for example. And the first thing I'll say is, I'm not going to buy your coffee. And, even though the tension is to build a relationship over time, the overall message is that I'm not a coffee buyer. I want to be a salesperson. That, I want, everything that we do is on this cost plus basis. It's about transparency. One of the parts that makes us, going back to the more interesting question, and my point of view is around the racist aspect, is it's really one-sided. Think about this. It's like, you've been in the coffee industry. You show up, you ask for your altitude when your varietals, and what did you have for breakfast? And let me take some photos of your family, right? Tell me all these details of your life, and then goodbye. Right?
We may or may not buy this
very
coffee.
Rude. Are you bird friendly? What are your emissions? How much do you pay your workers? What is your profit? Right? Does anybody ask this of a roaster? You're a roaster. Did anybody ever ask if you're bird friendly? Did anybody, you know what I mean? Like that, it's just it's a one-way panopticon. Right. Where these farmers are completely always under surveillance, and it doesn't go the other way.
Why hasn't it changed?
It hasn't changed because there's systems in place. And the way that coffee is bought and sold and moves from one place to the other is a pretty advanced piece of machinery that we've inherited. But our inheritance has some dirty past. It started as a colonial enterprise and then was expanded under neoliberal, capitalism, and now we're left with what we have. But the point is that if you want to just have a quicker answer, it's risk. Who's taking on the risk, and who has access to capital, right? And so, right now, a farmer doesn't have any connection to their customer or their customer's customer. And to put some better numbers to it, in the more developed places, in terms of like places that have really well-functioning co-ops, that work with, a nice amount of like institutional and infrastructure and government support, a good policy environment, things are working well, they can expect to get maybe up to 80 some percent, 80, depending on how you count, like do the percentage, 88% of the export value. But yet you go to a place like, Kenya, where you would think that you have some of the same infrastructures and government support, farmers are getting like less than 50% of the export value of a coffee. And so if you just take a look at what's the export value of a coffee, that's one thing. In many ways, that's how competitive is this coffee in the world market. And that's one thing that we try to work on, is because that's about value creation. It's about quality development and a variety of other things. But the next one, and the most different one I spend the most time on, is what percentage of that is kept at the farmer level, right? And one of the biggest determinants of that is, how far are they removed from markets? I mean, let's think about this. Coffee is grown where? At the tops of mountains. The best coffees are grown at the highest altitudes, right? Where there's the least arable land, right? And where they're the furthest disconnected from markets. These are people that historically, think about Oaxaca. It's like a Neapolitan or a tiramisu of layers of just people that have moved into Oaxaca Valley and pushed whoever was there before one layer up that mountain. And these people, maybe intentionally moved up there for safety purposes, like at some point, right? And now they're growing the best coffee in the world, right? And so this is this story. This is why smallholders are mostly indigenous in places where they can be, right? This is why it's a unique product and a unique supply chain. And, so in that sort of environment, you have to take a look at, how do you get a truck? Or how do you get a motorcycle? How do you get anything down up to a point of aggregation big enough where you can get it down mountain? That requires cooperation. That requires a group of people working together. And that's why I mean when I say that coffee is inherently political. Yeah.
When you think about the economics, and we're going to take a step back, but I feel like we need to continue this question. When you think about the economics of coffee, its true cost, obviously, when you talk about producers, and this was my biggest realization, I think I learned that from just, tagging along with you on some of these trips and like going out on my own. But every producer is so different than the next.
Yeah.
That in coffee, especially in specialty coffee, there's a generalization of supporting the producer that is often, I'm like, well, some producers, yes, you really want to support. Others, you're like, I used to do this thing when I showed up, and I think I learned this because my first trip to Origin, and I'll talk about that, was with you, right? And it wasn't really Origin; it was a place where coffee is grown. I established it, but my first trip was with you, and after that, I remember the thing that you told me. You said before we even went, meet me in this place, Villa Alvarez, right in Colima. Whatever you're imagining, like going out there and taking pictures of the ladies picking, and like wherever you think you're going to stay, it's not going to be that. So get your expectations right before you get there. And I'm not going there because of, this is a trip where you're going to go and like, take pictures for your social media and shit. And I've found that, I was like, that's cool. I respect that. But what I've learned since is that every place that I've gone to, when you walk up to the farm, if there's more than 2 ATVs and a new truck, I have a different level. I almost want to walk out because it's a different situation. What the biggest takeaway I've gotten from coffee is that the producer, to put it in the simplest of terms, lives up on a hill, and everybody else, even the temporary workers that comes from, especially in Mexico, come from countries like Guatemala that are working for a lesser wage, or come from as far as Chiapas, working in places like Nayarit or Colima. They're not part of that producer story. I mean, they are in a way because they do a lot of the work, but they're not looked after the same way.
They're not landowners.
Correct.
Yeah. Yeah. So if you take a look at, you're thinking in many cases, a Latin American context, estate.
Right.
Right. So absolutely. Our focus has always been, up until very recently, actually, on exclusively smallholders wherever we can. For that reason, because it does get around a lot of concerns around land ownership issues and empowerment issues like this.
The big thing is that the way that specialty coffee, more than anybody, has used the supporting the producers theme, because I really think it's just a fucking theme to sell more coffee. Some of it is again, not a popular opinion, but it helps with the brochure. It helps to put it on the back of the bag. And it covers this generalization. We're helping the producer. And you're like, well, how? Mm-hmm. And this is where you go back to what you said, is that it is an unfair, it's an unfair system where you get to come in and say, hey, how much are you paying those people? How much are you paying that person? Are they getting a fair wage? It's like, you don't really get to do that, as you say, with anybody else. But I don't know, man.
Well, until you have a long enough relationship with a farmer and they've bought their second ATV and now you can, start really pushing on these things.
Right.
And so it's an expectation. We talk about this. So as we work more with the states, we've had to get a little bit more mature on dealing with this issue because it is important. And I do think that the next issue in coffee as an industry should be around labor. There is no visibility on this.
None.
Right. But to be clear, like we're talking levels past where we are right now.
Right.
Right now, people are like, oh, I pay a lot of money for a coffee, ergo everybody's happy and everybody gets paid. And, I'm not doing any harm. I'm only doing good and yada, yada, right? And there's a lot of work that needs to be done to bridge some of these gaps of understanding. But my point being is that like in labor is one of the critical issues. And I do think that it touches a lot of things that has to do with migrations and migratory populations. In places that you're familiar with in Mexico, like look at Veracruz, 20% or so lower production last year. Why? Because there was no labor, you know what I mean, in many ways, and because of different migration flows.
Which goes back to what happened the year before and the reason why people left, right? Because they held on to a lot of their coffee and they thought they were going to get a higher wage or get more money for it at one point if they held on to it. And people were like, we're not getting paid, we're getting the fuck out.
Yeah.
So,
but I mean, even labor itself goes back to a matter of risk. Because if you don't know what you're going to get for this coffee, you're a farmer, okay? How do you know how much you should pay your labor, right? And so that uncertainty forces people to turtle up and be as conservative as possible. And that economic theory, if you can either maximize an outcome or minimize the risk or downside, farmers are running that every time. And that's many, many ways the difference between commodity and specialty. It's about minimizing your risk, minimizing the cost versus maximizing what's possible. When you taste a coffee, for specialty coffee, you cup it. You're asking, what's good about this coffee? It's affirmative. When you're liquoring for, commodity contracts, you're just being what's bad, what's off contract for this, right? And so, it's a mentality that like, I'll push back on the 2ATV thing. It's important to know who you're working with and to dimensionalize the context of everything, right? But, I would love for farmers to be successful in having ATVs. And
100%.
I mean, the fact, like, would you open up a farm if you didn't have access to lines of credit or insurance?
No.
Like,
absolutely
right?
not.
No, okay. So like, but if you did and you somehow managed to work your way through, wouldn't you get an ATV?
Yeah, no, of course. Yeah.
So
that is, I think, the biggest problem with it all, right? Is that you make an assumption of one thing and you realize on the other end that it's an entirely different story.
Yeah.
So I guess this is probably a good transition to go back and say, what the fuck is it that you do?
Oh, hi. My name is Jake.
What is it that you do on a day-to-day, and what is it that your company does?
I talk with a lot of people.
I know.
Yes.
You do.
I work with Crop to Cup. We are coffee importers, but we're trying to do a slightly different orientation of that. So we functionally act as importers. We bring in coffee, buy these container loads, and we break it up into different smaller bags and sell it to different roasters. But one of the ways we do this a bit differently is by presenting ourselves as a sales team. So because we're cost plus, we can sort of trace your purchase as a roaster, which you bought from us in the past, to back to the farm gate and sort of just have everything a very complicated conversation, as hands-on as you want to get, right? And so that's kind of the approach. We're seeing how it works. It's working pretty well because we get to choose the people we work with. My job is go find people that I really enjoy. One of the questions that you had prepped me with before today was like, who are some people that you've met that have really stood out with you? And I get, my response is just everybody, because every supply chain I get to build and we get to build together is built around good people. Like our original phrase as a company was, good coffee comes from good people. Don't take coffee from strangers. Turns out that like bad people can also make good coffee. So we had to sort of back away from that one slowly.
Yeah, you get a few stories.
But you get the point. Like the idea that it's not something that's grown on the tree. It's actually like, it's something that there does have a je ne sais quoi, a qualitative value to a coffee. In fact, as a, important aside, when I went to go start the company, I wanted my dad's, blessings, really mostly, approval, like I guess everybody. And he really guilted me. He just sort of got his tired, disappointed face on, and he just goes, well, I don't know. I always thought you'd get higher education. And so I went, at the same time I started Crop to Cup, I went to grad school, and I ended up being basically a specialty in cognitive science, asking the question that if I serve you the same coffee, but I present it to you, the same coffee in different ways, how is it that I can get you to write down a different experience? Why is it that you did have a different qualitative experience? What does quality mean at a deep, philosophical down to, business process level? It's a really fun conversation. And what we found is that, generally speaking, people connect with whatever's close. It's, the barista, for example, or the brand. they may care about the farmer, in some ways. And we came up with different profiles of what people care about a little bit more than the other. It was a fun way of adding some dimensionality of language to getting to understand about why people care about or could care about coffee as more than just caffeine. And so I bring that up to say that this sort of emotional aspect about coffee is kind of what's fun. Buying, like, why do you care about this person? Makes a difference. And we're lucky. Like, that's not true for things like chocolate. Like, I love and I very much respect the bean to bar movement and everything around there. But I fundamentally feel that like chocolate is either a gift or candy. It's a splurge, or it's something that's about packaging.
Right.
Whereas coffee really does have this sort of beautiful middle ground. So anyway, that's a bit of a distraction. But
you at this point have traveled. I mean, you have a long list of coffee. You hit up just about every coffee producing country in the world, right?
No, not at all.
Which ones do you have left?
Oh, quite a many.
That many?
Yeah. There's, so first of all, I work with other people that cover other countries. And so I have not, even Crop to Cup, we work in 12 different countries right now. And I have not been able to work in all 12.
Really?
Yeah. So,
Out of these places that you travel to, which is the one that you work on that has taken the most out of you?
The answer to this one. Mexico breaks my heart
Really?
Every year.
I didn't know that.
Oh, you didn't know that?
I mean, I would have tied it back to malaria and shit, but...
Oh, yeah, no, physical? Sure. There's been physical hardships and otherwise. Mexico does not have the... I mean, it can be hard roads in Mexico, but it's one of the easiest, more fun places to travel from a physical comfort point of view, right?
Mexico, right.
Yeah, I mean, it's delightful, right? But just from a getting things done, from a building trust, from building groups of people that want one another to succeed and provide mutual support and knowledge sharing within groups, that's been really tough. Yeah. So, that...
What do you think that is?
Oh, specifically in Mexico?
Yeah.
Well, part of it goes back to what we talked about earlier on, is that there's a well-earned history of skepticism in these communities where we work. We're not working with well-established co-ops in Veracruz, for example, or large farm owners in other places. These are smallholders that either had to sort of take over through one way or the other, abandon estates and plantations and sort of make their own way and sort of be self-sufficient communities, or sort of just claim land in a different way. But a lot of our work is in the South, where they say that the revolution never reached, right? When it comes to land reform in Mexico.
Talking about Chiapas and...
So I haven't yet. So yeah, mostly I'm thinking about Puebla and Oaxaca. And it was when I made that statement. But yeah, certainly in Chiapas as well. And what's happening in Chiapas right now. But Chiapas has benefited by having more nonprofit support that has come through, and there is more community cohesion and capital there, to the point where you do have large cooperatives. And there's a lot of complaints about them, but they still exist, whereas they don't exist anymore. So in the rest of Mexico.
What do you think?
The job of cooperative is to organize and
Right.
work and provide services for members and to market their coffee, right? And they, going back to the earlier part of our conversation, in the 90s, they all closed down because there was a shift towards neoliberalism, to sort of smaller government and, letting competition sort of work its way out, right at the same time as you had the coffee crisis. And then came, leaf rust. So coffee rust, which is a disease that came in from and knocked out, I believe in some areas up to 70, 80% of their crop, right? So a couple things just hit these farmers back to back to back to back. And they've had promises. And, when people go there to say, I'm going to buy your coffee or make you this promise, the question is, do you have cash? Are you going to be here next year? You know what I mean? Like, there's a lot of questions that they might have in terms of, like, can they trust you? But the other part is internal. We did a lot of work with groups in Guerrero, for example, that were going very well, that became victims of their own success. When all of a sudden you have one ethic of a community that's been used to being paid the same for everything. That's one ethos. What's fair for you is fair for me, right? We get the same. And then all of a sudden, somebody comes in with a relationship, or everybody has that relationship, but all of a sudden your coffee can be sold for my coffee. What do we do as a community with that extra premium, right? Or let's say that we're not used to having to sell our coffee past our farm. Now we have to go through the additional steps of the administration of getting this coffee to export. If not everybody's involved in that, how do we trust that there wasn't money that was eaten from there? So there's a lot of stress that happens internally within a community that comes with success. And in some places like Sumatra and in Mexico, that's been tougher for community cohesion. It's not aided by the fact that there's a lot of subsidies in Mexico for starting your own organization. So you can go ahead and, if you were to splinter off as a group, get some government support for forming a new group. right? And so that's part of that. That's part and parcel. And then the last part is really anecdotal. And I'd actually like to hear your part on this. I want to flip the mic around here. But a lot of it has to do with how do you measure satisfaction? Like what makes you happy when it comes to, was it a good payment? I asked you, was it a good harvest? Like, what does that mean to you? And like, that has a different answer, different places you go. And one thing that I would say to be more true in Mexico than it is in other places in terms of how common it is people base their success based off of how I did versus my neighbor, right? And it's not like, how did I do versus last year? Or how did I do versus my needs? Or how did I do versus how I was expecting, right? Or how did I do versus everybody else? Or how did we do, right? There's very much of like, oh, and if somebody has success, the assumption is, oh, they cheated somehow. They had unfair access or something that was ungainly or unfair about that success. And that's not true everywhere, but like it's a gross overgeneralization. But when it comes to just like trying to describe my interactions, it's difficult. But that's also true that it's generational. So a lot of the most successful relationships we've had have been with groups that are run by women, or run by groups that are really 35 years and younger. Under 35, under 30, even better. And it's just a different mentality.
Why do you think that is?
Social media. In many ways, I think that things are generational.
A lot more awareness of what's right.
Our generation has gone through some changes, right? And we bridge a different generation before us and one behind us, right? But if you skip a generation, you go down to these ones, especially to the 20s. I mean, the kids are all right. Like they're just kicking butt right now. People are really super engaged. They're sharing things at a super level.
Right.
Like I don't know. Like it's top-notch stuff. It's stuff I can't keep up with.
Yeah.
And like that's happening. You see it here in the U.S., but you absolutely always still see it in everywhere the coffee's grown.
I saw that 5 years ago, and I think I reached out to you as soon as I went. I was in Puebla, and it was exactly what you just described. And I was like, dude, this guy got a bunch of money from the government, and now what he's doing is making sure that some of these young kids are working, which is a topic within itself, right? As a community. Oh man, there's a dark story in there somewhere about Oaxaca, but we'll leave it for another time. But I saw it, and I saw that the conversation was very different. The way they talked about coffee, and the goals were like, look, we're using this as a way to send more of these kids to school from Puebla, right? And then you saw a lot of the science, and it wasn't like even their own tested science. It was things that they were so ahead of the game because they watched some shit on YouTube, and there was grafting going on, which you just didn't see that. I hadn't seen that to that point. And these guys were ahead of the game. It's like, hey, we want to grow geisha, but in order to do that, we need to make sure that we have a stronger root, and therefore you have these women who are tying this thing. And it was all incredible to me. And I think I called you right away. I was like, dude, there's some amazing stuff happening in Puebla.
Yeah, I mean, think about let's just make this real for people listening, all right? Let's pretend like corn, all right? People have grown corn, but all the interest and curiosity and expertise and science has really been put around how do you make it more yieldful and more resistant, right? Plant it closer together. Now take all that interest and how do you make it more flavorful and more interesting? And that's what's been going on in coffee. Right. So when you talk about geisha, the exploration and access to different genetics, right? And the knowledge of what's appropriate, right? The knowledge base of that is incredible. The soil science and the leaf tests and everything that's available now that just wasn't before. The terpene fingerprints that are going on, and all the way down to the processing side. There's certifications now. You can take a class on actually how to ferment coffee.
But I feel like a lot of that's happened in the last 6-7 years.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
And I remember we had this conversation. We were in Mexico, and the last person was about to take the term, and he was saying all the crazy shit about cutting out some of these, something like an entregado, right? Like cutting out these middlemen and giving the money directly to the producer, which for the most part he followed through on some of that. Not necessarily a good thing, though, because it destabilized the way that people were doing business. And
oh yeah, that's what you meant earlier on by rocking the boat.
A little bit, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
Well, not a little bit. It was actually quite. I mean, Colima, which you spent a good time. What, like 2 years, 3 years there?
Oh, 6.
6 years.
Yeah, 6 years.
6 years working at it. That's amazing. Yeah. But that's got to crush you when you've been putting in that time. You see the improvements. Things are changing, and then from one year to the other, it just goes to shit.
Well, I mean, earlier on, like when we were talking about, a lot of the work was more new to people, and it was more disruptive in that way of switching ethoses and being disruptive. The idea of quality was new. Do you remember at a time in coffee when it felt like being a magician? You were the one that could like make good coffee appear
Right.
to your friends and family, and you were the coffee guy in somebody's phone.
Right.
I'm sure. You know what I mean? And like the point being is that there was a time in our industry when that was true on the supply side as well. When this idea of quality was new and performance-based payments and talking about things in terms of a cup score. And now you have farmers that refer to their coffees as numbers in cup scores, and they talk about the varietals that they didn't even know they had before. So I mean, things have changed. The awareness has just blossomed, right? So yeah, I do think that like it's just part of the extra. At that time, my job was much more about forming groups, and the Entregadora was because there's all these different community groups that had no way to export their coffee in the state of Colima, right? And so the idea was that they could come up with a nonprofit volunteer association of cooperatives that could be the export representative for these groups and help their coffee to get to the U.S. And that's how we worked in Colima, right? But that required us creating that, right? And in many ways, that doesn't need to happen anymore. There's always some other way that you could do this. And so we don't have to be in the position of trying to form groups. And now we can be much more in the, hi guys, here's the service. This is a game. It's a weird game. But if you're interested in producing for specialty and you want to play this game, we're one option. We can help you to play this game. Yeah, it's a much more comfortable conversation.
There's something incredibly important about the work that you do that, I mean, you do it as just part of a job. Like people think that you're going out there just to say hello and make some relationships. But when you go down there, there's a job to be done to keep that consistency, the transparency, to essentially make sure that the thing that you supported 5 months before is the same thing that you're getting at the end, that I'm getting at the end, I should say. Tell us about those inspections, what those trips look like.
Sure. So do you know the difference between a coyote and a coyotito?
Yes. I mean, the coffee terms?
Receipts.
Yes.
So,
actually, you talk.
So I think disclosure is the first.
You should probably explain what a coyote is.
Coyote would be a middleman that, I mean, there's many different hands that touch coffee as it gets from, a farmer's farm to somebody drinking a cup. The question is, do they add value? And do they offer transparency and records, right? And that's where the receipts come in. So like, if you're a farmer, there's a coyote between us and I bought your coffee. Do you know how much I bought it for? And do I also likewise have access to you? So it's a two-way sort of access, what role they play. And there's always gatekeepers in all these communities. In many ways, early coffee was very much about breaking through those gatekeepers. And now, I mean, you still have to do that work, but it's the bridges have been built and the expectations have changed on that. So you still have to work on it. You still have to push information down, put out radio programs, make massive WhatsApp groups, right? Making sure that things are flowing and being pushed through in so many different ways.
Just to let people know that we are watching what is happening.
Yeah, publishing information down, because information leaves farms, but it doesn't very rarely comes back. So a lot of my job is pushing information, right? And just making sure everybody has the same information. And at the same time, asking for disclosure. So it's is the first step, the first answer I'd give to you. It's all about, the first move we have after starting a relationship is we just call it an informational audit. And so it's all about disclosure. And we go through and we ask a variety of information and we just take note. We'll ask questions, we'll clarify. But really it's just the form of baseline. And then we come back and then we're like, okay, let's do this again. And also what's changed and why? And could it change? Should it change? And that's a little bit more in pace with what it is to grow a relationship. You can't come in there year one and be like, build toilets. You know what I mean? Like, where's your drainage and your water treatment, right? So like, you have to sort of be a good partner in that sense. So disclosure, starts with sort of informational audits and then goes into this other thing we call trust and verify, which is this idea that like, if you were just going there and auditing, it would people game the game, they game the system. But if you don't put any systems for oversight, you put people, it's like a Chicago alderman. You're in a situation where you're bounded, no matter the best person, they're going to be put in a situation that's not fair to them, when it comes to like making the right decision over a course of time. So to be fair, you just put in systems of transparency and disclosure, and you take a look at what you're going to be measuring. There's a lot of communication that goes back and forth, and it's pushed down to all members throughout a supply chain.
But it doesn't happen all the time from everybody that does your job. A lot of people just show up and buy the thing and then sit on the coffee, figure out a way to get it over. There's not that much intentionality. A part of what I love so much about what you do is that, and this is where when I think of coffee and I think of mezcal, for example, it's very rare that there's an inspector coming and saying, hey, what are you doing with that negative oxygen water? You're dumping it back in the fucking river. You just killed all the fish and everything else that comes with it. And as the agave brand, for example, the mezcal brand gets bigger, it goes from like, hey, can you produce? I know you're producing 1,000 bottles. Can you produce 10,000? And nothing else is improved. The roads don't get better. The access to water doesn't get better. The people aren't getting paid more.
Yeah.
And you're still using very much 4 or 5 different people to do 4 or 5 different jobs. A jimador who went from cutting down 100 plants, or let's say 10 plants a day, to like now 35, right?
Yeah.
He's still getting paid the same rate, maybe a little more. But I think that's the biggest difference. That's part of the reason why I love what you do so much in coffee that doesn't exist in most places. And I think, if anything, fuck, man, I think agave importers need to just spend a lot more time in the coffee world to see what exactly that is, because it doesn't even compare. And I could say that from a place where I've taken both trips. I've traveled with the importers of mezcal, and I travel with coffee people, and they both get fucked up at the end of the day on mezcal, but very different.
And they both wake up to coffee.
Correct. Yes.
So yeah, I don't like the mixing of the two, though. I'm a purist.
No, that's gross.
Yeah.
But even going back to some of the stories, not to get too sidetracked, but on those trips that we've had to Oaxaca, and even before then, when we were in Colima, you taught me something that stuck with me, and it wasn't just the simple lesson, but I feel like it encompassed so much of what you do. When you called it rule number 4, but you probably pulled it out of your ass, and that's okay. But do you remember what rule number 4 was?
That was chapter 4. Always tip the mariachi.
That's right, chapter 4.
Yeah.
But it's not just about tipping the mariachi.
No, it's about if you appreciate something that's there. It's a multi-layered thing. It's a reminder for myself. And I'm glad that you understood it, because it was very personal. I did not know it would translate at all. But to try to unpack it, part of it is that if you appreciate something that's there, you should pay for it. You should actually support it. So to the extent that you appreciate that there is a mariachi out there and that they exist and you have the means, do it. The cool thing about a mariachi, in my experience, is that they're not asking for any specific amount of money. Even if you have like a peso, you know what I mean? Or nothing at all, that can be okay. It's about treating with respect. The second part of that goes to a very different part of the world and a prior experience. Another ribbon I have around a finger, that's a Indonesian word called rame, which means, it was described to me as such. So picture like a hotel bed. Everything's clean and crisp, like brand new, like you're the first and ever person to ever be there. Right now, the opposite of that. Now you're in a family bed with your family comforter. There's a dog, like everybody's piled on. There's like whatever snacks are involved, right? The latter is rame. They're both beautiful. But there's a difference to it, like a new car versus your favorite first car. And you can go on and on and on. But when life bleeds over itself. And I use that as a reminder because, like, just from by benefit of where both of us have grown up, there's a comfort zone that we have when it comes to things being personal space, for one, or organization, or seeing something as chaotic or not beautiful because it's just beautiful chaos, for example, right? That's rame. So I remember rame, and I took that into this idea of, always tip the mariachi, because we have this feeling, this natural reaction from where we come from to say no when somebody comes up trying to sell us something. And we just shut out the world. We say no to experiences without, starting from a neutral position. You can say no. You don't have to tip, if you don't have any money, don't do it, but always tip the mariachi. So just to start there is just don't say no. Get away from that no mindset. Get away from, and closer to a rame mindset, of a reminder of where we're coming from.
What do you think is the biggest threat to your industry right now? Trade embargoes, tariffs, or global warming?
Of only those 3? Oh, man. There's a lot of context needed to make this like the discussion, but there's a lot of threats going on.
Shoot.
Let's see.
Bigger than those 3.
Yeah, but I mean, global warming is obviously it's just such a higher magnitude. It's massive.
You've been in this industry 20 years. You've seen it.
Yeah, I mean, it's the thing. But the thing about global warming, it's about comorbidities, right? It's global warming right? And it's, global warming accelerating things. So we can absolutely talk about global warming by itself. And I think that we should, in many ways. It's its own conversation. But when it comes to threats to the industry, the more pressing things is, you're talking to me on a day where over the past couple of weeks, we've seen many records set when it comes to people who pay attention to economics in terms of like the market prices and otherwise. The volatility out there is crazy. Just like I said earlier on, that debt is a matter of optimism. in many ways, this market, it represents a reality and a perspective of what people think where the world is and where it's going. And it's been setting some weird records lately. And then we could go into all the reasons why. And it takes a little bit of a different form in the different countries where you go and the different companies you look at. But in short, this global system is starting to shake up a little bit right now. It's under a lot of stress.
What do you think that is?
Global warming is part of it, but we're also seeing the end of this sort of expansionist era of, free market expansion. We're seeing the world get put into different blocks. Politics are getting involved. COVID saw an incredible checking on just-in-time shipping and the way that this clockwork of organization was done. Right now, the price of coffee on the markets, Brazil produces over 40% of the world's coffee. Their cost of production is what decides the world's price of coffee. It's highly subsidized, highly mechanized. It's like going to Iowa. The only way to compete with that is to have a very low cost of labor and a low cost of land, i.e. devalued peasants. You know what I mean, in a sense. So there's a weird aspect at play that, there's a disconnects that have just been left over and not tended to. And so now we have a frost in Brazil and we have lower production. And so all of a sudden the cost of producing coffee in Brazil is actually at a point where people can actually start making money the rest of the world. But in the process, I think it was last month, $7 billion of margin calls were put in. $7 billion. A margin call, to be short, is one way that larger companies will hedge against risk, is essentially to take a bet on the futures market. And in doing so, if it changes too much, they need to put more money into that bet account. It's sort of just to keep the prices stable. And the cost of stabilizing prices, the amount of money they had to put in there, it's driving out of business. There's some big names out there that I won't name now, but the one that is public news, ED&F Man had to sell their coffee division to bring in venture capital money to go ahead and bail them out. That's one of the big boys. This is one of these groups out of Switzerland that moves commodities.
It's not
both sides. And I'm not talking about just the small people. I'm talking about the big as well. Right. So massive shakeups, man. Massive shakeups are going on. And, we'll see what happens on the other side. I'm fresh back from Kenya, right? And I don't know if you've been following what's happening in Kenya.
Yeah.
It's fascinating. But in every different country, there's either labor strikes going on, right? Usually you would see in Peru and Colombia or on the eastern coast of the US, right? Or there's, to the point of coup d'etat, at least economic and kind of political coup d'etats going on in Kenya. And it's happening across the world in different ways. So, whether you take a look at the credit system, whether you take a look at logistics and containers, or you take a look at, local governments and sort of how that relates to trade and trade policy, it's fascinating. And that's just now getting into global warming and climate change and what's happening on the farms and in the environment.
When it comes to coffee and buying it, where do you go for stability?
Where is stable?
Where you're fuck it, we're going to get away from, because Kenya's a different world when it comes to buying the coffee, right? That whole process is different than they're all different. Yeah. But Kenya's got a very particular one where you go about 25 miles outside of the airport.
Oh, you can, yeah. But I guess I take the mentality of a farmer where when things get hard, you go back to the village. So we go far away. So in Kenya, for example, a lot of our work now and in the future is going to be in the Western Rift Valley, a place that you've probably no one's ever talked to you about coffee from Western Kenya because it's always been sold as Kenya AA. And so we're trying to go outside of places. So when things get nasty, you go to places where, you go further away. and then there you can, work in a way that you can still add a ton of value and sort of bridge some gaps. Yeah.
You have some of the most fascinating stories in coffee. And one, there's going to be a point where you're going to have to write this book. And I cannot wait for that. I think it'll be incredible in many levels as regards to how coffee works, the storytelling of it. But, one of my favorite stories that you shared, because I used to have this coffee from Gurma. Mm-hmm. You know which one I'm talking about? Which story? Mm-hmm. Can you share that story? Because I think this is a way where we transition out of this thing.
You're talking about my visit to Gurma and Shatu?
Yeah.
Oh, wow. There's a lot. So Gurma Shatu is a farmer in Western Ethiopia. There's a lot of context I could do that make this more interesting. But I guess the point being is you have to go from a car to a pony, and then the pony gets stuck in mud, and then you have to go by foot. And then if it rains, then you're kind of stuck there. This is the story you're talking about?
That's one of them. That's
okay.
Good. I remember that story.
How about you cue me up?
Yeah, this is a story about the guy looking for, was it his brother or his dad? You know what I'm talking about?
Oh, yeah. That is Gurma Shatu.
It is, right?
Yeah, that's Gurma Shatu. So, okay. This is an earlier story. So, so Ethiopia, in short, if you have done public service and you die in public service in Ethiopia, the best of my understanding, there's a chance that you get land from the government. And this can be controversial because it means you could be from the south or the east or a different place and then be given land mostly in the west. The west is sort of the more less developed part of Ethiopia. And so when you're given land, let's see, I'm blanking on this story a little bit because it was, Gurma comes back to us. Oh, that's right. So Gurma's family was given land.
Right.
He leaves. His mother doesn't have any money to develop this land.
Right. She just leaves.
And she just leaves. Okay. So he is raised in the South, where his family's from. Later on, he becomes an engineer. He ends up working for a brewery in Ethiopia as an engineer. And then
the brewery
in Ethiopia. And then on the side, starts making coffee washing machines, a piece of equipment to take the cherry off of that. And in selling those, he goes back out to the West where this land was. But he didn't know that. And he didn't know that he was from this area. And so he sees somebody that looks like him. And they start like asking people, and in Africa, you oftentimes introduce yourself in these parts of Africa, last name first. It's like, who are you related to? And so quickly comes from like the shape of your cheeks to recognizing that he has long-lost relatives over there. And so there uncovers the land, starts a coffee farm on it, moves back out there. And that's the story of Gurma. But that's why this land is out in the middle of nowhere.
This used to be a land that belonged to them in the first place.
It belonged to them in the first place.
That he
correct.
found way, way later, which was an incredible story because for us, being able to share that story as we sold the coffee. Was,
yeah.
I mean, there's so many of those that you have. We'll wrap up with one last thing, I should say, is, and again, going back to the storytelling, because I think it's so important. We could keep talking about commodity and everything else and how Mexico works. But you in a way, in the last 22 years that you've been doing it, 22 years?
Yeah, that's probably about right, yeah.
Which is a story that, like, out of all the many, that has stuck with you the longest?
The one story?
Yeah, I mean, you got so many. You got one story. I mean, I have my favorite. Mm-hmm. This is why I'm waiting for you to write the book, but like for you personally.
I want to hear your favorite first. That'll give me time to cycle through a little bit. Tell me your favorite story in coffee.
Man, I think for me personally, on like something that happened within our first trip, right? And I've told this story in the past where we were in Komala. You took me to Komala, and actually it was even before Komala. You took me to the center of Colima, and there's this hotel with a rooftop. Remember that?
Oh yeah, yes.
And then we were just drinking colimitas. And this dude dressed in black just shows up and he just starts pouring mezcal to everybody. And it was just the funkiest shit I've ever had. And then I went looking for him and like nobody had seen him. They're like, what are you talking about? I'm like, no, I swear he called it like raicilla or some shit. And nobody had a clue. And then finally, like, I kept looking around the hotel and I asked you guys, or like, dude, you saw him, right? And you're like, yeah, I mean, we're drinking this shit. And at the end of it, it's like, as we're leaving, like, oh, you're talking about this guy. Yeah, he comes up. He just pours mezcal. It's his own stuff. But if you go to Komala, you'll find him. And a few days later, we went to Komala. I was like, hey, can we go? And then I just walked around for like a good 2 hours, just lost on my own. And I couldn't find the guy. But it got weirder and weirder. And I didn't think anything of it other than the fact that, there's a reference to a book that goes back to Juan Rulfo and Pedro Paramo and this strange, not strange, but really a ghost of a town, if you want to call it that. And that was it. That's how my obsession with Kamal. I never found the dude. It's like it never happened. Yeah. That's how my obsession with mezcal started, or at least that part of mezcal, something that was different. And I'm like, yeah, man, I went. This is my first trip to Mexico and Colima, and this dude invited me, and like, I swear I'm not making it up. I came back and I started asking everybody. Nobody sold the shit. Yeah. It was very rare. So that was my favorite tie into your own story of something that's happened to me with. I mean, there's so many things that have happened to us.
No, but you touched on it because that's what I like what you do, because there is something about coffee that touches into the magic, and it's harder to believe it until you get yourself out away from a city, up into a mountaintop, into a magical place. There's places that have some feeling to it, a bit of gravity, and oftentimes they can grow coffee there too, right? And so if you put the two together, like in that particular case, things happen. There's lore. There's more than just coffee, right? And there's a bit of a tapping into that unknown, into that mystique. And like a lot of these places are like that, to be honest with you. And I think that that's probably my favorite part of my job is that there's some really crazy, it's a crazy, beautiful world in which we live. And like, if you want to talk about Brazil and some of the weird experiences that we could have in Brazil and the people you'll meet, right? Coffee is this interesting magnet, like not just on this side that we're like really interesting black sheeps or whoever's are drawn to it, right? Like, this is, you do a lot of food stuff and you are somebody that I would say is not unabashedly is a foodie. My belief is this, is that foodies are not just interested in the gastronomy. They're not just interested in this sensorial pleasure. I think you're all just curious. And I think that you want to learn. And I think you want to develop your preferences. And I think that process of learning, of developing your preferences, of going from an awareness of, oh, there's different styles of wine or coffee, to building this mental map of how to construct and navigate this world, complicated, interesting, intriguing world of coffee, right? Or wine or whatever food you're into. And then coming up to the point of feeling like you have ownership over that, to the point of being like, you got to try this restaurant, or what's your favorite coffee, right? Or knowing what you're looking for. And when it comes to people, when it comes to profiles, or whatever it might be, that's what makes it gorgeous. And I do think that foodies are just curious, and learning is what makes it fun. Coffee is genius because it's infinite in what you can be interested in. My personal interest is I think that people are always more interesting than coffee. And so I have found myself very fortunate to go out there and just find some of the most interesting people in coffee. They come from incredibly different walks of life. So, the idea of being able to walk into those shoes and recognizing that you're the one with a return ticket, but then to go ahead and put that to the side. Like I had asked you before coming to Mexico, maybe I was just projecting something I do for myself. But the idea is to sort of take your agenda. You have work to do, to take your expectations. You're there to go ahead and be an ambassador, and you look like what you look like, and all these other things are true, but you need to really actively put these things on the side if you want to be present in a place, and if you want to actually get to know a place. And so being able to step into these communities where, the sun rises and you're above the clouds, right? Or where like you go and crawl into, a mud hut with a sort of an oven that's built around you and get packed in, with a bunch of herbs and smoke, right? Or just the most, interesting traditions for whatever reasons it might be. So like there's 1,000 different, evenings that I've been invited back to a home, been able to partake in a small gesture of hospitality and just really sample the beauty of like diversity that we have in this world. So it's a beautiful, beautiful industry that we're in.
Love it.
Yeah.
My brother.
Thank you.